Hi guys, this is Adil and today we're going to be solving October-November 2020, that is variant 12. So let's get started. Okay, so the first question says what causes economic agents to make choices? So economic agents are basically consumers, producers, and the government, and they're responsible for contributing to the GDP and running the overall contributing to the overall income for the economy, right? So, what causes the economic agents to make choices? So, limited needs and wants, nope. Existence of finite resources, the existence of finite, definitely. So, B would be the answer. The existence of the finite, that is limited resources, is due to which we make choices, because obviously that results into scarcity, right? It's because we know that resources are limited and our wants are unlimited. So, question number 2 says which combination of a factor of production and its factor income is not correct? So guys, factor of production are our resources and the factor income represents the rewards on those factors of production, or you can say the returns on those factors of production. So the factor income for capital is interest. So this is correct. Enterprise, it's profit. Obviously the reward for starting a business is the amount of profits that you earn. For labor, it's wages and it's written dividends here. So obviously the answer would be C, because it says that which combination is not correct, right? And for land, remember that the factor reward is what? It represents income. It represents rent. Question number 3 says the diagram shows a PPC for a country. Production possibility curve basically represents different combinations that you can produce in an economy which is given resources and given technology. PPC can be from the micro perspective. It's drawn by a firm, that is product A, product B, good A, good B. You can draw, but that is micro PPC. A macro PPC would be like it is drawn over here: consumer goods and capital goods. So the question says the diagram shows a PPC for a country. The country moved from position X to position Y on the PPC. So the country moves from X to Y, which means that it is definitely buying more of consumer goods and less of capital goods. What is the most likely reason for this change, right? So firms have decided to increase investment in technology. Investment in technology would result into an outward shift of the PPC, but this is basically representing a movement along the production possibility curve. The new economic resources have been discovered. Again, it is represented through an outward shift in PPC. Option C says the government has brought about an increase in living standards, so this makes sense. Option D says that the government has encouraged long-term economic growth is basically your potential growth there, which they're talking about, which is again represented by outward shift in the PPC, or in macroeconomics it is represented by a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve as well. So the correct answer would be C. The government has brought about an increase in living standard. Obviously, because living standards increase because of more consumption in consumer goods. So if the economy is producing more consumer goods and consuming more consumer goods, so obviously the amount of living standard would be increasing, because consumer goods would result into satisfaction of wants, which would hence increase the utility of the consumers. Question number 4: what is an example of macroeconomic aim? So it says to create and maintain full employment. Okay. Then it says to improve efficiency. Obviously no. To provide consumers with greater information. Nope. This is not a macroeconomic aim. To encourage greater occupational mobility of labor. This is also not a macroeconomic aim. Mobility of labor is something that definitely helps, but it helps reducing market failure. That's one of the microeconomic aims, not the government's macroeconomic aims. Yes, governments do intervene to try to reduce this immobilities, but again, that's on a microeconomics perspective. So the correct answer would be A, to create and maintain full employment. Okay, because full employment represents a situation where all resources are fully employed. Question 5 says why might a market economy fail to achieve the best resource allocation? The best use of scarce resources means rational resource allocation. Allocative efficiency is what we are talking about. In question number 5, it says consumers may lack information about which goods to buy. So basically, when a market economy is failing to achieve the best use of scarce resources, kind of telling us that there's market failure in the economy, right? That is, there's misallocation of resources taking place, right? So some goods might be overproduced, some might be underproduced, some might not be produced at all, right? Such as public goods. So consumers may lack information. Imperfect information, lack of information is again a market failure, because it would result into misallocation of resources. Either consumers would buy goods with bad quality, maybe they end up paying high prices for it. Producers would overcharge consumers, right? So they would end up not buying the right product for themselves, right? And they would think they are getting utility out of it, they're getting satisfaction out of it, but they might not be getting the amount of satisfaction they thought they would be receiving, and plus they would be paying a high price for something that is not worth that high price. So again, the answer to 5 is A. B, C, and D, it's not possible because demerit goods are overconsumed. It's written under consume here. Public goods are overconsumed. In a market economy, public goods are not produced at all. The government provides them. Most resources are owned by the government. No, this is also not market failure. Question 6 says the diagram shows the global market for copper with an equilibrium point of X. Okay, so this is the equilibrium point. It says which point represents a new equilibrium after the copper producer's cost increases, which would obviously reduce supply. And there is a rapid global economic growth. Now, sudden global economic growth would obviously result into an increase in demand for copper, right? So whenever the demand for copper would definitely rise, the demand curve would shift to the right, so demand would increase. Now, a lot of students freak out when they see these kind of diagrams where the curves are shifting right and left, and there are 2-3 curves drawn. But there's a technique to it, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. You basically need to break the process and do it step by step. So firstly, it says that supply is moving to the left, so obviously it has to shift to S2. So it's S2, okay? And then it says that a rapid growth, which means demand is increasing. So obviously it means that S2 has to intersect with, since demand is increasing, so the demand curve would move outwards to the right. So S2 would obviously be intersecting at D3. And now you guys need to see where is at which point is S2 intersecting D3. So S2 intersects D3 at A, so hence the correct answer for question number 6 would be A. So we're right. Let's move forward. Question 6 is also solved. Now we move to question number 7. Question number 7 says the diagram shows the supply curve for a good, and the supply curve is upward sloping. It's given the original price. It says that calculate the PES when the price rises from 10 to 12, and obviously rise in price would result into an increase in quantity supplied because there's a direct relation between supply and price. So the formula for PES is percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price, right? So if you guys don't know how to do price elasticity of supply, so if you guys don't know how to calculate elasticity of supply, so I also have detailed videos on my YouTube, so you guys can see over there. Okay, so it says percentage change in quantity supply divided by percentage change in price. So basically, how will we calculate? Okay, so remember that whenever we need to calculate a percentage change, we use a formula that is new minus old divided by old times 100. So what is the new percentage change in quantity supplied? That is the new quantity supplied is obviously 140. So we're going to write 140 minus old is 100 divided by old is obviously 100 times 100. So this gives us the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by, it says divided by the percentage change in price. So again, we'll apply the same formula, but this time we're going to be inserting price instead of quantity supplied. So the new price, new minus old, so the new price minus old price, the new price is 12 minus the old price is 10 divided by 10 times 100. So guys, if you calculate the elasticity, I don't have a calculator with me right now, but if you calculate the elasticity, this would definitely come up to, the PES would come up to somewhere around 2.0. So the answer to this question would be 2.0. Understood? That is answer option D. Moving on, question number 8, it says which task is not a function of trade unions. Okay, so what are trade unions? Trade unions are groups of employees, or you can say there's a group representation within an organization of employees that are working for a common goal, that is increasing the wages of employees, improving their working conditions, and fighting against any kind of discrimination that employees may face based on gender, race, religion, stuff like that. So trade unions can have positive as well as negative impacts on the economy. So and it has various functions, right? Apart from just increasing the wages and improving the working conditions, there are various other functions of trade unions as well. So number 1, it says question 8 MCQ option 8, agreeing the minimum number of to be employed on a particular job. Okay, so this is a function of trade union, because trade union do play a part in deciding that how many what is the minimum number of job of people that should ideally be employed for a job, not what the employer thinks should be the minimum figure, right? So So definitely this is a function of trade union, so this is not the answer. Okay, so deciding on the level of national minimum wage. Okay, so this makes sense because the decision of the national minimum wage is not in the hands of trade unions, it's in the hands of the government. The government would decide ultimately what should be the minimum wage. However, if the trade union is of an industry, a large industry, a strong industries trade union, it may make suggestions, to the government or the industries union. Different industries unions might collaborate and give suggestions to the government and what should be the ideal minimum wage rate. But the national minimum wage decision would always lie in the hands of the government. So deciding on is obviously not a function of trade union, hence B is the answer. C and D are obviously part of trade union's function. Question 9, what does not have an effect on the wages in a free market economy? So the wages in a free market economy for labor are determined by the demand for labor and the supply of labor. That results into an equilibrium wage rate and an equilibrium outcome, that is the number of workers employed in a labor market for any occupation. So question number 9. A says danger levels in the workplace. So obviously danger levels in the workplace would definitely have an effect in the free market, because obviously it would result into decline in the demand for the occupation and hence resulting into lower wages. So obviously answer option A is not the right option. Government regulations, yes, this makes sense, but let me explain this question. So part C says the number of people willing and able to work. So guys, the more the number of people who are willing and able to work, obviously the more the supply of labor, because supply of labor refers to the number of people who are willing and able to work. So the more people willing and able to work, the increase in supply of labor that would be in that occupation, hence that would reduce the wages. The years of training required, the more the number of years for training required, the more the number of SOPs or protocols there are for entering into an occupation, the more education required, obviously the less the less the supply would be, and the more inelastic. First of all, the supply would be less, and at the same time it would be more inelastic, because workers, even if wages are rising, so workers wouldn't really be attracted to that industry, because obviously they know that there's a long journey or a hard way to reach there. So but you can see that for occupations that do not require a lot of skills, we see that the number of workers are more into that industry, and hence that brings the equilibrium wage rate down. So government regulations does not have an effect on wages in a free market economy, because government regulations do not affect the labor supply. Government regulations have an effect on the cost of production for firms, so it has nothing to do with labor market. So 9B is the correct answer. Moving forward, it says the table shows how household spending changes with income. Okay, so basically spending is so you have income, and either you can spend and either you save, right? Spending results into more GDP, more employment and incomes, right? So it's giving you income per month in dollars, spending per month in dollars. So if you deduct your spending from your income, so obviously the answer would be saving, because income that is denoted by Y is either your consumption plus your saving, right? So if you have 100 rupees, you either consume 80 and then you save 20. So let's apply this in this question. So 3000 is your income, you're spending 3150, so you're saving negative 150. In the second one, you're having negative saving, because obviously you're not saving anything, because you're saving because your spending is more than what you earn, right? So obviously you will have a negative saving. Again, I don't have a calculator, so I won't be able to get the exact figure right now. So in the third one, it says income is 3600 and spending is 3500. But okay, so here we see that since spending is less than income, so there's a positive 100. Well, I don't need a calculator to calculate this. So 3600 minus 3500 gives us positive 100. So we see that the saving has now started becoming positive. Over here as well, the saving would be positive. Over here as well, it would be positive. And over here as well, it will be positive. But the question says, what is the lowest level of income at which savings are positive? So the lowest level of income at which savings are positive is basically 3600, because the lowest possible positive saving was when the income was actually 3600, right? So the question could also have asked you what is the lowest level of income, sorry, what is the lowest level of spending at which they're saving. So, and in that case, obviously, still the answer would have been 3,500 if they would have asked about spending. So the correct answer is answer option B. Question number 10, part B is the correct answer. What can a central bank? Central bank is the government's bank. It is a state bank, like in Pakistan, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve in the US, right? So what can central bank increase in order to reduce consumer borrowing? So in order to reduce consumer borrowing, you need to make consumer borrowing expensive, right? To make that expensive, you need to increase the interest rates, because that would increase the cost of borrowing. Simply increase the rate of interest, because that would increase the cost of borrowing. That's it. So when the rate of interest would rise, the cost of borrowing would rise. That would make borrowing loans more expensive, and hence less loans would be bought, both by consumers and by firms. And that would obviously reduce consumption and investments, and that would reduce GDP as well. So question number 12 says, the table shows the output and total cost of a small firm. Okay, so the output is given, the total cost is given. What is the average fixed cost of producing 10,000 units? This is a very simple question. Students would end up, making calculations. I don't know what not will they do, but they're failing to understand that the answer is right in front of the table. They're asking you about the average fixed cost. So the formula for average fixed cost is basically fixed cost divided by output, right? So do we know the fixed cost? Have they given us the fixed cost? Have they given us the fixed cost separately by writing that this is the fixed cost? No. They have just given us the total cost. And total cost is basically the sum of fixed cost plus your variable cost. Fixed cost are costs that do not change with output. Variable cost, they change with output. They are directly proportional to output. So, guys, now tell me, if you're producing zero outputs, how can you incur a cost? Obviously, you can't incur a variable cost. So whatever the cost you are incurring at zero output is your fixed cost. So what is the fixed cost? So the fixed cost is 50,000. Now, if you produce 1,000 units, 5,000 or 10,000, your fixed cost would stay at 50,000, right? And they're asking you the average fixed cost of producing 10,000 units. So you divide 50,000 by 10,000. So it will give you $5. That is A is the correct answer. So moving forward, 12A. Question number 13, it says, a firm has a fixed cost of 1,000. Okay, the table shows the variable cost at different levels of output. Output 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have variable cost 100, 190, 270, and then 350 respectively. If goods are sold for 500, okay, so selling price is given as 500 per unit, and then your fixed cost is 1,000. How much profit will be made on the sale of 4 units? So the formula for profits is profit is equals to selling your sales minus your cost, right? The formula for profit is sales minus your cost, or selling price per unit minus cost price per unit. So either of that. So guys, sales, what are sales? Sales is basically your total revenue, that is price times quantity, right? Cost is your fixed cost plus variable cost. So what is sales? If how many units are you selling? You're selling 4 units, right? So 4 units, that is, but the selling price is 500, so 500 times 4 would give you 2,000. Now that is your sales basically. This is your sales. 2,000 is your sales from 4 units. Minus your cost. Your cost represents your fixed cost plus your variable cost. Your fixed cost is already given as 1,000, which won't change whether you make 3 or 2 or 4 or million units or maybe whatever. So variable cost, they've given us already 350 at 4 units. So 1,000 plus 350 is basically how much it is? 1,350. 2,000 minus 1,350 would be 650. So 13 should be A. 13 is the right answer. Question number 14, it says firm X supplies bricks. Firm X supplies bricks and decides to merge. Okay, so it's a merger. It's an integration with firm Y that also supplies bricks. Okay, so a brick supplier merging with a brick supplier. That is the same stage of production. So that would which form of merger is this, or which form of integration is this? This is basically horizontal. It's not backward vertical, neither conglomerate, neither forward. So the answer to 14 is D. That is David. It is horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is basically, when there's basically a merger or a takeover between you can say two firms in the same industry, and they're operating basically at the same scale of production. For example, you can give the example of Warid and Jazz, or you can give the example of Walt Disney and 21st Century Fox is another example that you can give. Okay, so moving forward, it says who owns the public sector organization? Yes, who owns the public sector organizations are owned by the government. So 15 should be David. Question number 16. What are the two aims that a government normally pursues when managing the performance of the whole economy? Now, what are the two aims? They're basically asking you the macroeconomic aims. So to encourage an increase in production and to prevent high inflation, yes, definitely we want to increase the production and we want to prevent high inflation. This kind of makes a bit of sense. Let's see the other answer options. To ensure no one is unemployed and to reduce exports. No, this is not. Although we want to make sure that no one is unemployed, but we don't want to reduce exports, so you cancel this. To give everyone equal incomes and to increase government revenue. Okay, so to increase everyone equal incomes, yes, we do want an equal distribution of income, but increasing government revenue is not the macroeconomic aim. It is one of the ways of ensuring that the aims are met, because the more revenue we have, the more our budget, the less budget deficits we would have, and definitely, the more the more government spending we can do, hence more aggregate demand and more GDP. So this is also wrong. And to protect the environment, and so protecting the environment is yes one of the macroeconomic aims, because you want to reduce externalities as much as possible. Although reducing externalities is not one of the primary aims, but yes, it is one of the secondary aims. To reduce interest rates is another policy, that is a monetary policy, that's not an aim. To increase production and prevent high inflation, yes, that is definitely, because to increase production means to more GDP, that is an aim. To prevent high inflation, obviously low and stable inflation is our aim. Question 17. What is most likely to be the responsibility of the central government? The provision of immigration officials at an airport. Yes, this makes sense. The provision of immigration officials at the airport are obviously employees of the government. Remember, in most countries, airports are owned by the government. For example, the Jinnah International Airport in Pakistan is owned and controlled and regulated by the Civil Aviation Authority of Pakistan. So yeah, so the provision of immigration officials at an airport is the responsibility of the central government. 17 should be A. 18 should be the table shows the tax that an individual would pay at different levels of income. So we can see that disposable income is rising by 10,000, and then our taxes are also rising by 2,000. So basically, what type of tax is shown? It's clearly showing that it's a progressive tax, because progressive tax is a tax where the burden of the tax, or the amount of tax in terms of the burden, or as in terms of the tax, the proportion of the income being paid in tax, right? It rises as you increase your incomes, right? So for example, an example of progressive taxes would be direct taxes. Direct taxes are progressive, such as income taxes, such as wealth tax, stuff like that. Question number 19 says, if the tax would have actually been decreasing in this case, then it would have been regressive, which causes an unequal income distribution, and progressive taxes cause more equal distribution of incomes. Question 19, that is why during times of relative poverty, unequal distribution of incomes, when the government wants to reduce poverty, that is one of the ways to reduce indirect taxes, to put downward, put kind of sort of downward, to reduce the pressure on the poor. Question 19, the government wants to reduce the consumption of cigarettes. Cigarettes not a good thing, demerit goods. Which policy would be most likely to do this? Increasing subsidy, that is going to result into increase in production and consumption of cigarettes. Not a good. It would result into government failure, which is something that you would be studying in your it's a whole topic in your A levels, right? So this is you cancel this off. Okay, income taxes has nothing to do. Wait a minute, income taxes has something to do, definitely. Let's see, increasing interest rates, no. Increasing indirect taxes. Okay, so increasing income taxes, again, increasing income taxes does make sense. You know why? Because when you increase income taxes, your disposable income reduces, and then the less the disposable income you have, the less the cigarettes that you will consume. But obviously, it would also result into consumption of other essential goods as well. So and this is not the most effective measure. So obviously, no. Increasing interest rates, the more interest rates you have, the more the cost of borrowing, and one could argue that the less the loans you will take, and the less the loans you will take, the less the consumption, and the less the consumption, the less the money spent on cigarettes. But obviously, that's a whole long process, and you won't be taking a loan for buying packets of cigarettes, right? Unless you are some kind of I don't know. So Um, the answer to question 19 should be ideally be D, because remember, indirect taxes are those taxes that are imposed on firms, and as a result of that, it increases the firm's cost of production, because it makes producing goods more expensive, since producing in each additional unit the government has to pay an additional tax. Sorry, producing each additional unit the firm have to pay an additional tax to the government, right? And that increases their cost of production, hence it reduces the supply to the left. And I have a whole YouTube video on indirect taxes, on the effectiveness and evaluation of indirect taxes on reducing market failure. Do check that out. So question number 19 part, the answer should be D. Definitely 19 should be D. Moving forward, question number 20, it says which group should not be included in the measurement of unemployment. Okay, which group should not be included in the measurement of unemployment? Let's see. Redundant, unskilled workers seeking alternative work. Okay. Unskilled workers who are redundant and they are seeking alternative work, why shouldn't they be part of unemployment? Because when you are measuring unemployment, you include all those workers who are part of labor force. And since these workers are part of labor force, the labor force include all those people who are both employed and unemployed. So if you're measuring unemployment, you need to see that what is your amount of labor force present in the economy. So 20 should not be A. Seasonal agricultural workers temporarily out of season, definitely they would be included because it represents seasonal unemployment. So this is also not the answer. Those who have left school and cannot get a job. So those who have left school and they cannot get a job, that's their headache. Since they have left school, it means that they have entered the workforce. We're assuming that. And if they can't get a job, then obviously they are also part of the labor, since they are part of the labor force. And if they're unemployed, so they do come in the definition of unemployed. So yes, it's not the answer. The answer should be, so this, although I haven't even read option C, but I can obviously conclude that if I've made the right conclusion on A, B and D, so C should be my answer. That is, you can solve the MCQs using elimination method as well, but since my job is to tell you why C the right answer, because students over 18 years continuing with full-time education. Now students who are over 18 years of age are part of the working age, right? They are now covered under the working age, but if they're continuing with full-time education, it means that they are not part of labor force. So remember that there are certain people who are exempted from labor force, and they are students who are working full-time. Then you have retired people, then you have people with disabilities, you have prisoners, you have people on pensions. So all these kind of people are basically people who are not part of labor force. So and technically you can't even call them unemployed. So for example, if I am a student and I'm 18, maybe I'm 19, and if I'm a student and I'm studying full time, so I don't have a job, but I'm studying because I'm studying, but technically I can't be called unemployed. I'll be called the label of unemployed. The label of unemployed on me only makes sense when I am actually in the labor force, and I would only be in the labor force when I'm seeking work, right? When I am willing and able to actually work. Understood? So 20 should be C. Okay, so question 21 says that the table shows the rates of unemployment and real GDP growth for an economy in 2014 and 2018. So the rate of unemployment in 2014 is 3%, and it has grown up to 10% in 2018, right? And the rate of real GDP is 4%, and then it's minus 2% in 2018, which clearly shows that there's a direct relation between the unemployment rate and the real GDP rate, because we can see that as the unemployment rate rises, the real GDP growth is falling, right? And in fact, in 2018, the rate of real GDP growth is actually negative, which is showing that the output has actually decreased, because when it's a negative growth, it means that the output has fallen. At times, students, you need to be very well aware of this, that at times the examiner may confuse you by saying that maybe the rate of growth in 2015 was, let's say, 5%, and then in 2016 it was, let's say, 4%, right? So a lot of students mark their answers by saying that this represents a fall in GDP, and in fact they're wrong, or they write that this represents a fall in output, because this is actually not a fall in output. In fact, the output is rising, but only the rate of increase has slowed down. Or you can say that the output is rising at a decreasing rate, right? So be very careful and mindful of this, right? So the answer to this MCQ, that is MCQ number 21, would be answer option D, because it says that which combination of policy measures would be most effective in returning the economy to the 2014 level of activity, which means that we need to actually reduce the unemployment and we need to boost, or we need to increase our real GDP, right? So increasing government expenditure would obviously boost your employment, because when the government will increase its spending on infrastructure, maybe in the form of transfer payments, maybe through subsidies, or maybe through investing more in infrastructure, investing more in merit goods, education, healthcare. So obviously, when the government invests more in the economy, it would increase the employment in the economy, and hence consumer expenditure would subsequently rise as well, because more incomes would be generated, and hence your aggregate demand would rise, which will obviously reduce the demand deficit or cyclical unemployment in the economy. And obviously, decreasing the rate of interest would make cost of borrowing cheaper, and that would make borrowing more cheaper for consumers and for firms as well, because consumers would borrow more money for consumer expenditure to finance their expenditures, and firms would borrow more money to finance their investment. So that is why option D is the right answer. And this is kind of, you can say, it's an expansionary demand side policy. In decreasing the rate of interest is an expansionary monetary policy, and increasing the government spending is an expansionary fiscal policy. I hope you understood this. Question number 22 says an economy is experiencing rising prices. Which government policy will help to reduce the consumer expenditure? So as prices are rising, which means that there's inflation, and one of the ways to reduce inflation is through reducing the aggregate demand in the economy. And if you reduce the consumer expenditures, what is going to happen is that AD will fall, and hence less consumers will spend on the economy, because the reason why demand pull inflation occurs is because there's a lot of demand in the economy. People have a lot of money in their hands, and hence they're spending a lot, and the economy does not have the output to back up that spending, because the resources are less to produce the goods, or maybe the output is not being produced, or the GDP is not being produced to an extent that supports or matches the aggregate demand, or you can say the output is not as such to match the increase in your aggregate demand, and that is why it results into demand pull inflation, and hence your price levels rise. So it says which government policy will reduce consumer expenditure. So again, reducing consumer expenditure is a demand side policy. Either it could be contractionary fiscal, or it could be contractionary monetary, right? So the first is introducing compulsory saving for income earners. Now this kind of makes sense. Part B says investing more in building infrastructure. No, because investing more in building infrastructure would actually increase aggregate demand. Issuing more bank notes would obviously increase money supply, and hence increase aggregate demand. Reducing indirect taxes would increase consumer expenditure, as it would make the goods quite cheaper. So the answer option should be 22, should be A, that introducing compulsory saving for income earners. And let me tell you one more thing. At times you're not able to identify the right answer because you don't understand the answer options during the exam, due to exam pressure. So what we can do is, instead of finding the right answer, just try to figure out the wrong answer and just eliminate all the wrong answers, and the left option would obviously be the right answer. So understood. So part A, introducing compulsory saving. So if the government introduces or makes a policy, it makes saving mandatory for the income earners. What happens is that whatever income we're earning, we need to save some of it, and obviously you guys know that saving is basically a withdrawal from the circular flow, which means that all the income will not be spent, right? It will be saved, and saving would reduce the amount of money that is reinvested back into the circular flow of income, and hence it would reduce the consumer expenditure, reducing aggregate demand, and hence reducing demand pull inflation. Question number 23 says some goods take a greater percentage of typical household spending than others. How is this accounted for in the construction of a consumer price index? Now, constructing a CPI, we construct a CPI to calculate the rate of inflation, and how are we going to use this? Obviously, it's the answer option is not A, it's not C, neither D. The answer is B, by giving a weight to the goods, because obviously some of the goods are taking a greater percentage of typical households. Households total spending means average households total spending, like me and you, right? So if certain goods consume a greater percentage of our spending, maybe me and you spend more money on, let's say, clothes, or a typical average person spends more money on buying clothes, right? A middle class person, let's say. So obviously, then when we are constructing the CPI, we rank that, right? So we are going to give that particular expenditure a greater weight as compared to all the other expenditures in a typical basket or an average basket of goods. So the answer is B. Question number 24 says, in countries with absolute poverty means that the poverty is extreme poverty, which is below, you can say, people earning less than 1.5 to $2 a day, and we cannot afford basic necessities. The other kind of poverty is relative poverty, which is a comparative analysis of poverty, like some people are poor, some people are rich. So you're comparing that. So even in countries sometimes may not have absolute poverty, but they may still have relative poverty. And relative poverty all has to do with the distribution of incomes in a society. So low incomes can start a process that keeps incomes low. So low incomes is starting a process that is keeping income low, which is kind of showing a poverty trap that, you're stuck in a rut where low incomes is generating further low incomes and you can't grow out of it. And usually developing countries face this. So what are the stages of this process? So if you have low incomes, this does not always means that all of that less incomes would translate into low consumption, because a lot of times people who are poor, they tend to spend all of their money and they don't have savings, right? Because they already have low income, so they're going to spend all that money on consumption. So low incomes does not mean low consumption always. So again, this answer option would not be possible. Then low incomes means low government spending. Government spending has nothing to do with incomes. Government spending is independent. So government usually spends more money either to increase the GDP or increase the national incomes, or it spends less money to reduce the national incomes in times when the inflation is very high. So again, no, this is also not possible. Now I don't need to read the remaining, because obviously, now this is a trick. There's no need right now to read the remaining of the whole answer, because we need to complete the answer in a limited amount of time, right? So low incomes would mean low investment. Okay, this makes sense. Low investment would not mean high profits again, so this is also wrong. And high profits means high dividends. So high profits obviously will not translate into low dividends. So all the three options are wrong. So obviously the D should be the right answer. But again, let's see if why is it the right answer. So it should be the right answer because it says low incomes means obviously low savings, because more will be consumed. Low savings definitely will translate into low investments, and low investments will translate into low productivity, and hence that would translate into low incomes as well. So that is why question number 24, part D is the right answer. Okay, so question number 25 says, which factor in the world's low income countries, like developing countries, limits their economic development? So guys, first of all, you need to understand what economic development means. So economic development is basically, you can say, a measure of the quality of life, because there's a difference between economic growth and economic development. Because economic growth is basically your increase in GDP, that is increase in real GDP, increase in real incomes, is basically referring to economic growth. But economic development goes one step beyond economic growth, and it deals with it gives a more holistic view of the fact that whether economic growth is leading to improvement in welfare or not. Because economic development represents the fact that what kind of welfare we have, what kind of quality of life we have, So it's basically a measure of quality of life. It's basically a measure of your living standards, right? So remember that whenever healthcare improves, whenever life expectancy improves, whenever literacy improves in the economy, it all results into economic development. So which factor would reduce or limit the economic development in a country? Balance of payment surpluses? No, this won't be the answer. So it wouldn't be the answer, because balance of payment surplus would indicate more exports, and more exports means more GDP in the economy, and hence economic growth might lead to economic development as well, because obviously the more the GDP, the more the incomes, and better the quality of life. However, there's obviously a counter argument to it, because of externalities and all that results due to the production or due to the increase in GDP, that does restricts your economic development and your welfare. High saving ratios? No, this is not the answer as well. So large inflows of foreign investment would obviously improve the economic position of the country, because more foreign investment in terms of, let's say, hot money inflows, or let's say FDI, foreign direct investment in the form of multinationals, would definitely result into an increase in GDP, hence causing economic growth and assuming that it causes economic development as well. Although yes, it will cause economic development, but right now we are assuming there are no externalities. Rapid population growth would be the answer, because obviously the more rapidly population grows, the difficult it is to manage, the difficult effective management of resources gets, because obviously we have limited resources in the economy, and that would definitely result into, you can say, less resources, more people for consumption. It's difficult for the government to cater everyone. It's difficult for the government to maintain a high living standard, considering the fact that already the economy is in poverty, right? So rapidly, if the population is growing extremely rapidly without a subsequent increase in your resources and your factors of production to cater to that population growth and cater to the needs of the economy, definitely your living standards and your welfare would be negatively affected. So D is the right answer. Question number 26 says, the table shows the percentage employment in primary, secondary and service sectors in 4 countries. So primary sector is where your industry consists of works like raw material extraction, mining, farming, stuff like that. That includes the processing and the extraction, that primarily includes the extraction of your natural resources and employment generated from those kind of work, right? And secondary industries are industries where your manufacturing sector is dominating, where your manufacturing is taking place, such as production process, such as chemical production, such, etc. And your service sector is basically a tertiary sector, such as insurance, banking, healthcare, retail, right? So which country is most developed? So obviously the country that has the highest GDP coming from the service sector or the tertiary sector, that would be more developed, because service sector requires skilled labor and hence that requires high levels of education and training. So definitely developed countries do have a pool of skilled labor. So obviously now there's a trick to it. Again, like I said, whenever 3 columns would be given, try to find out the first column or any one column, and that would make your life easier, and hence you can eliminate some of the wrong answers. So for example, the highest service sector is basically country A. So either I can say that 20 and 20 would not be possible. So either the answer would be A or answer C, because these two are indicating a high tertiary sector thing, right? Because 55% employment is coming from service and then 30% from service as well. So maybe the answer would be A and C. And now let's look at the remaining options. So although the answer is right on the face, because the primary sector is least dominant, then a secondary sector holds more importance than the primary sector, which is one of the characteristics of developed countries, where the tertiary sector or the service sector holds the primary importance. It is the main feeder or the main contributor of GDP and employment and tax revenues for the government, followed by your secondary sector and least by the primary sector. So that is why A is the right answer for MCQ number 26. Okay, so question number 27 says that what causes birth rates to fall? The first answer option says fewer women working. So remember that theoretically, whenever more women are interested in their careers, the birth rate should fall, and when less women are interested in their careers and we have fewer women working, so ideally and theoretically, let's say, the birth rate should rise if fewer women are working, right? So remember this general theoretical rule. Part B says infant mortality rate rises. Now what is your infant mortality rate? Basically, infant mortality rate refers to basically the death of young children, right? It refers to the death of young children. But how young? We are measuring, what age limit are we measuring? We are measuring the age limit from birth up till 1 year of age, right? Up till 1 year of age. So death of young children up till 1 year of age per 1000 live births, which means that out of 1000 live births that took place, so out of those 1000 live births, how many children did not last, or they passed away, or they died up till 1 year of age? That is, we are basically measuring the death rate in terms of, or the infant mortality rate in terms of, like, all those children who were up till a year of age. Out of those 1000 that were born, how many died? So that is your infant mortality rate. So So technically no, but if birth rates, this has nothing to do with a fall in birth rates, okay. So B won't be the answer as well, but you should know what infant mortality rate means. It is the death of young children who are up till a year of age per 1000 live births. That is referred to infant mortality rates. So part C says, part D says the optimum population increases. Optimum population, what is optimum population? Optimum population is basically, you can say, a concept where your human population or the population of your country is kind of in balance, right? That is an optimum or an efficient population, or a balance is maintained between the amount of resources the economy has to feed the population. So they are in a state of balance. That is the optimum population size, or you can say the amount of resources the country has for the amount of people, for the amount of population in that country. So apart from optimum population, we have underpopulation and overpopulation. But you know that optimum population size is what a country should ideally aim for. Okay, so the answer 27 is part C. Medical supplies and healthcare improve, because now the logic behind this is, if medical supplies and healthcare would improve, what is going to happen is that living standards will improve, and if living standards will improve, incomes will improve, and maybe there will be a less need to have more babies because incomes are generally improving, because there is again a concept that poverty results into more birth rates, because people give birth to more babies because they will help them earn, right? So the less the need to have more babies, and as a result the birth rates will fall. So 27 is C. Question 28 says a country wishes to increase its current account surplus on the balance of payment. Okay, so balance of payment has three components: current account, capital account, and financial account. And let's see what current account is. So first of all, you need to know what current account actually is. And a current account is basically, you can say, it measures, right? It measures the flows of money, or you can say the inflows of money, inflows and outflows, right? That is money coming in, money going out because of various reasons. So what is current account? Current account basically measures the inflows and outflows of money coming into and going out of the economy because of trade in goods and services, that is trade in visible goods and trade in invisible goods, and due to you can say investment incomes, or let's say net factor income. That includes your interest, dividends, rent, remittances, net factor incomes, right? And your net transfers. And your net transfers are basically like international aid and gifts and donations, right? So basically, if the current account is in surplus and so if the country wishes to increase the current account surplus, then obviously what should it do? It should either improve the exports or reduce the imports. One of the ways could be. So which action would it take? It would abolish an import quota. Why would it abolish an import quota? It should establish an import quota, otherwise, so that the imports reduce. So 28 would not be the answer. The A would not be the answer. Increase import tariffs, yes, definitely, because if it increases the import tariffs, it would make the imports expensive and hence reduce imports, and that would make the current account surplus. So higher exports and lesser imports would make your current account in surplus, both for goods and for services. Removing export subsidies is not a good option, because if it wants to improve the current account surplus, it should boost exports, and one of the ways to boost exports is to give more export subsidies so that domestic firms become efficient and competitive. Tax import producers, no, this would also not be the answer, because they should ideally not tax export producers, otherwise the cost of production for exports will rise, which would make the exports uncompetitive as compared to international other countries. Hence exports will fall. So question 29 says the table shows the country's exports and imports. So there is export of goods, import of goods, export of services, and import of services is given as well. So what was the country's balance of trade in goods and services? So balance of trade in goods and services, so the formula would be export of goods and services, because they are saying the balance of trade in goods and services, so we'll take export of goods and services. So if they would have asked us to calculate the balance of trade in goods, we wouldn't have taken the export of services. We would have only taken the export of goods. And same goes for if they would have asked us to calculate the balance of trade in services, we wouldn't have taken the goods, both exports and imports. So we'll take export of goods and services minus import of goods and services. So export of goods is 200 plus 35. This gives us $235 million, minus import is 190 plus 38. So 190 plus 38 would give us somewhat $228 million, and then if you deduct it, the answer would be 7 million in surplus. Why? Because obviously exports are greater than your imports. So whenever exports are greater than your imports, it would result into a surplus. So the answer is C, right? So a surplus, whenever there are exports are credited into the current account, and impure imports will be debited into the current account. So question number 30 says the diagram shows the value of a country's exports and imports of goods over 5 years. Between which 2 years did the country have an increase in the value of imports and an improvement in its balance of trade in goods as well? So like I said in the previous question, balance of trade in goods would mean export of goods minus import of goods. So let's see in which year was there an improvement, right? So the white bar is representing the export of goods and the gray bar is representing the import of goods, right? So in which 2 years did the country have an increase in the value of import? So if we take year 1 and year 2, right? So year 1 and year 2, the imports are increasing. Yes, the imports are increasing. We see that there has been an increase in imports from 15, let's say, to approximately 17. But has there been an improvement in balance of trade? I don't think so, because the exports are the same, which means that imports are rising and the exports are same, so it would worsen the balance of trade, not improve. So this is not the answer. Year 2 and year 3. Now let's take year 2 and year 3. In year 2, from year 2 to year 3, yes, your imports are increasing from $17 million to somewhat $24 million. Approximation, we are doing the approximation, we are taking approximate figures. But is the balance of trade improving as well? So let's say this is the in year 2. So to year 3, the imports are, let's say, they rise from, let's say, from approximately $17 million to, let's say, they rise to $24 million, right? From $17 million to, let's say, $24 million in year 3. And the exports in year 2 were, let's say, how much? The exports in year 2 were $20 million, and now they are close to, let's take it $25 million. So the exports were, how much? The exports in year 2 were $20 million, and now the exports in year 3 are, let's say, $25 million. So let's calculate the balance of trade position in year 2, and that would be 3 million. It would represent a 3 million surplus, and in year 3 the surplus is $1 million, which is 25 minus 24. So we can see that the surplus has reduced. The surplus has not increased in from year 2 to year 3. Now let's see part C, that is year 3 to year 4. So guys, we can see that in year 3 the imports are approximately 24 million, and in year 4 the imports have increased to 25. So imports have increased, but only very slightly. So we can see that there has been a very slight improvement, or we can see that there is a slight increase, not improvement would be the wrong word. There has been a slight increase in imports, right? But we can see that the exports have significantly increased, surpassing or crossing the increase in imports, which is, so your exports in year 3 were approximately, or let's say 25 million or even 24 million, but your exports in year 4 are close to 29 or 30 million, right? So there's a big jump. So obviously, which means that even if you numerically calculate this, it will obviously show an increase in your surplus, which means that your answer should be C for Charlie, that is year 3 and year 4. But still, let's do one thing. For the sake of satisfaction, let's do calculate it. So for instance, let's see that your exports in year 3 were how much. So your exports in year 3 were, let's say, how much your exports were, let's say 24 million, let's take it, or I'm not, let's say it's 24, or in fact let's take it 25, right? It's 25. So your exports were how much? Your exports were $25 million, and your imports were how much? Your imports were, let's say, let's take this 24, and your imports were, let's say, 24 million. So there was a surplus of $1 million. Okay, so in year 4 what has happened? Your exports are basically, right, your exports are $30 million, and your imports have increased a bit, only slightly, and your imports are how much? Your imports are 25 million. So 30 million exports, imports only increased by 1 million, that is 25 million. So obviously your surplus has actually increased by 4 million, from 1 million to 5 million. So this was the question. The question was that in which 2 years did the country have an increase in the value of imports? Definitely the value of imports have increased from 24 million to 25 million, right? Which means that your imports have increased in value, and at the same time an improvement in its balance of trade and goods. So this can only happen, although ideally if imports increase, the balance of trade position deteriorates, it falls. Either the surplus reduces or there's a deficit. But only and only if your exports increase by a much larger extent than the increase in imports, only then that would offset the negative effect of increase in imports, and that is what has happened over here in year 4. Their exports have significantly increased from 25 to 30 million, that is, they have increased by 5 million, and that is why so there has been an increase in exports of 5 million, and there has been an increase in imports of 1 million. So if I deduct 5 million from 1 million, there's a 4 million surplus. The 1 million increase in imports is taking away the positive effect of 5 million increase in exports. So I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. I'll see you all in the next video with another paper solution, and keep practicing, keep working hard, do your best, and I'll see you all in the next video. Till then, take care.